Just getting her in the bite part, we might want to hook up this component.
This is how you can raise the
Just
toe.
any way you need to.
Now, do you feel like you're hanging on it?
I'm just going to test this IV while they're doing that.
Okay, just lift your head straight up.
In you go, Denise.
Denise is a cocaine
I'll get
user.
you some tape, Mary.
She has volunteered for research at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, where neuroscientists are taking pictures of her brain on drugs.
Okay, Denise. Now you're going to hear the beeps for about 2 minutes. Just slow, loud beeps. Hold real still.
This gives us a picture of the thinking, feeling, living human brain as it processes information over time.
So those are good-looking images.
We literally see the activation of specific circuits in the human brain.
Nice-looking brain. Great. Just cleared that component. We'll get ready to place the experimental slices. Excellent. This person had a significant amount of rush and high from the test dose. And so I suspect that we'll get a wonderful effect.
Exactly.
Because she is awake and functioning, the scientists can talk to Denise while they x-ray her brain's blood flow.
You'll start to feel something in your left arm. That will be the infusion.
It is a delicate and carefully choreographed process.
You may get 2 doses of saline, you may get 2 doses of cocaine, or you may get one of either, okay?
Dr. Hans Breider is the team leader.
Let's do it. Okay, we have 10 seconds until we start the infusion. 6, 5, 3, 2, 1, now.
Dozens of images taken over a short period of time show where in the brain the drug is active, where craving for the drug actually takes place.
Look at that screen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Dr. Steve Hyman once directed Harvard's initiative in mind, brain, and behavior. He now heads the National Institute of Mental Health.
So here it is. We turn on this checkerboard
Is
pattern,
that centered for her?
and now we're going to be able to see whether, even in the presence of cocaine, we get the normal expected activation of the visual circuits.
Okay, that's a nice acquisition.
As the drug is coursing through her veins and getting into her brain, we're going to be able to get a picture of her brain as she is reporting to us.
She can actually tell you what she's thinking or feeling at any moment you're taking a picture of the drug impacting on a part of her brain.
That's exactly right. We're getting a map of her feelings. We're getting a map of what structures in her brain are active as she reports the feeling of high, as she reports later on, after the drug wears off, the sense of craving or wanting the drug.
Okay, excellent.
Literally, what this allows us to do is get an image of desire in the brain. Now, this is not only interesting from point of view of fundamental aspects of our humanity, it also has a practical significance for people who are addicted to drugs. Because if we know where in the brain drug craving is, we can start to think about what chemicals are involved, what the timing is, and perhaps come up with better treatments which can be administered to affect the right cells and, very importantly, at the right time.
There's something about these biological changes that are going on at the neuron level, at the cellular level, at the molecular level, that gets translated into compulsive uncontrollable drug use. The electric current comes down the neuron, the little chemicals get released here, got it? These are the neurotransmitter, dopamine, coming out of the first cell.
Dr. Alan Leshner is director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which provides more than $400 million annually for research on addiction.
That addiction is fundamentally a brain disease. Let me just show you a diagram.
Leshner is often on the road to talk about the findings of addiction research. Today, he's at Eastern Middle School in Silver Spring, Maryland.
The problem is it's not just a brain disease. Addiction itself is actually a result of a combination of environmental factors, historical factors, the physiological state of an individual, like their genetic background. They all come together through the brain to produce addiction, but it's not any one thing all by itself doing it.
You call it a disease.
It's a disease because it's a result, actually, of drugs changing the brain in fundamental and long-lasting ways. And it's a chronic relapsing disease because typically, sadly, but typically, people don't have only one episode of addiction. They have repeat episodes. Addiction is not a voluntary circumstance. It's not a voluntary behavior. It's not just a lot of drug use. It's actually a different state.
I liked the effects. I liked it. I liked it, what it did for me, because it took me from reality and put me wherever I wanted to be.
I thought it made me smarter. I thought it made me more creative. I thought that I was more powerful. It made me complete, no question about it.
For how long?
For 20 minutes, and then I could do another line.
There are common mechanisms in the brain that are triggered by every major addicting substance. Now, we don't know for sure that this is the common essence of addiction, but it's very striking that all addicting substances cause a change in dopamine levels. That's nicotine, heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, alcohol, marijuana, all produce changes in dopamine functioning in the same general area of the brain.
Dopamine is part of our brain's vast and intricate communications network. All of us have some 100 billion cells or neurons in our brains. They communicate with each other by electrical impulses and the release of chemicals. These chemical communicators are called neurotransmitters. Dopamine is one of them. When we have a pleasurable experience, the brain releases dopamine.
So, for example, normally we might have a very positive experience and get a certain amount of dopamine released. We might have a wonderful meal. We might accomplish something. We might win a race and get a certain amount of dopamine. What the drug abuser finds is that they can literally fool the brain. They short-circuit the brain. They take drugs and they get this sense of well-being, of happiness, of euphoria. And what's really striking is that it's reliable. When they take cocaine, when they take heroin, they can produce this again and again on a regular basis. None of the vagaries of, will this experience live up to expectation? And that's what gets them in trouble, because by bombarding the nucleus accumbens and the rest of the brain with more dopamine than it had ever seen before, the brain adapts. It literally becomes dependent on the drug. It is changed by the drug. You can no longer feel okay once you're addicted without the drug.
We could sort of put the oligo in and ligate it in. Sounds like a reasonable idea.
Yeah.
In his lab at the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland, Dr. Hyman and his researchers want to know more about how drugs chemically seduce the brain.
This crew here is really studying very directly how drugs and neurotransmitters, the chemicals that nerve cells use to talk to each other, make long-term changes in the functioning of the brain.
Have you found the answer to his question about why the brain prefers drugs to broccoli?
Not yet.
We'd all be out of
You do know
business.
that. You know
We
that,
knew.
right? There's nothing in broccoli that taps into brain reward pathways. All of the most addictive drugs are natural plant products initially. So cocaine came from the coca leaf, tobacco produces nicotine, and opiates came from the opium poppy. Now the chemicals in, say, the coca leaf that produce cocaine fool the brain and literally reproduce, although in massive fashion, the equivalent of the released dopamine. There's nothing in broccoli that does that. Literally, the chemicals in a small number of plants are Trojan horses. They're masqueraders. They look just like natural chemicals found in the brain, and they fool the brain.
So they come in here and they say, that was good, but it really wasn't good.
That's exactly right.
And I'd go to a board of directors meeting, stand up there in a board of directors meeting and give a presentation, and I would give this image that I was fine, that I felt whole, and that I was competent. And I knew that that night I was going to be going around the back gate of the local Marine base looking for more drugs.
You don't feel like a human being when you're in the throes of this disease, Bill, because the things that you're doing are inhuman. You're lying, you're stealing, you're cheating.
People who are addicted will go to extreme lengths to get their drug of choice despite incredible negative consequences, despite all kinds of trouble.
This is telling them that they must have it, and it's changing their behavior to get it?
Absolutely. This has been hijacked. This part of the brain is there to say, this is good, this is important, this is what makes the world good for you. And what's happened is that in response to the drug, we have made this part of the brain and associated structures unable to function without the drug. The brain has been compromised, usurped, changed, whatever. You're a different person once you've been addicted.
The last 2 years of my crystal use, it got worse and worse and worse, and I knew I was in deep trouble. And I'd be up for his second or third night in a row, and I'd be in my apartment, and I'd be sure that there was somebody outside the door. I'd be peeking out from behind the curtains, trying to catch him. I knew about this paranoia that happens sometimes when you're a crystal addict. I knew it was there, but I couldn't stop it.
My mind told me to get on a window ledge. Well, I fell 4 stories down in a brownstone in Brooklyn and almost died.
I let everything around me collapse. You know, my house went into foreclosure. I lost my car. I kept my phone bill paid because I had to have the connection to my dealer. Ended up losing my job. That's always the last thing you lose is your job, because that supports your habit. I realized I didn't have any control. I realized no matter how much I wanted to quit, I couldn't. And it was the most fear I've ever felt in my life.
What we're talking about is there being in a state where the drug has totally taken over their being. What that means clinically is that they're in a condition where they suffer from compulsive, uncontrollable drug seeking and use. People are able to understand this now when they think about schizophrenic people who act in very bizarre ways. Why are they acting bizarrely? Well, there's something wrong with their brain. That's exactly what's happening in addiction. Something has changed in the brain.
You don't know you're falling in love with it. You don't know that it's beginning to take a priority, except for one day you wake up and you know you gotta have it because you can't function.
Literally what happens is that you take the drug for a prolonged period of time and it changes the biochemical processing in the brain. You stop taking the drug and that change persists. For example, with methamphetamine, we know that chronic use of methamphetamine reduces the ability to produce dopamine while you're taking methamphetamine for a long period of time. Then you stop taking methamphetamine and you still are less able to produce dopamine. 4 weeks later, 6 months later, a year later, we believe, we haven't proven this yet, but we believe that that then results in an inability to experience pleasure in a normal way.
So you go back to the drug again and again just to feel normal, to feel right?
Absolutely. So what happens with crack cocaine is that you take cocaine initially to elevate dopamine, and then after you use it repeatedly, dopamine levels go down, and then the person feels terrible.
In the beginning, it was absolutely pleasurable. It was exciting, it was erotic. You know, I really looked forward to it. I loved to get high. At some point, though, it was no longer exciting, it was just the way I was. I just did it to function. I did it to get out of bed. I did it to go to work. It was just the way I lived.
Drugs as a way of life become a vicious cycle. Chronic use creates the brain's need for more. Dopamine surges, then subsides. Pleasure gives way to pain, until use and abuse spiral into addiction.
There's a lot more helpful and hopeful information still ahead when...
To penetrate this puzzling and powerful vortex of drug addiction has taken some extraordinary detective work. Sherlock Holmes, meet George Koo.
Morning, George.
Morning, Pat.
At the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla, California, Koob is investigating the common essence of all drug addictions, whether the substance is alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamine, heroin, or marijuana.
Tony is preparing these probes for an experiment where
Koob and his colleagues are studying rodents to understand how prolonged and plentiful drug use depletes dopamine
This goes right into the brain of the rodent.
and how it affects other neurotransmitters.
So this is a very, very sensitive technique for measuring neurotransmitters. You can also see the
What looks to the layman like a satellite photograph of Hawaii is actually the neural landscape of a rat's brain. Koob's team has identified where the dopamine is released, an important part of understanding how, during addiction, the brain's reward system triggers a roller coaster of emotions.
And as you can see in this diagram here, the work has focused in on an area called the nucleus accumbens, which is up here in the basal forebrain, but also on an area called the central nucleus of the amygdala.
If you publish this as a map, would right here be the pleasure center of the brain, the sort of Times Square or Disney World?
Not so much a pleasure center, but a pleasure circuit. This is the circuit of the brain that we believe is important for guiding our everyday life.
To do the things we have to do, like eating to survive, sex to procreate.
Yes, and what we're discovering is that drugs of abuse basically usurp this circuitry. They take it over. In other words, you no longer seek out natural pleasures because the drug is driving the system. Our bodies are built, in my view, to experience a certain amount of pleasure.
A certain amount of pleasure, to be sure, but in everyday life, most of us don't go off the deep end with pleasure. Our appetites for food, for sex, are governed.
So the issue is that something regulates that. Why aren't we copulating all the time? Why aren't we always overeating? Why aren't we overindulging in any of these things that we need to survive as a species?
So there's something in the original blueprint that seeks pleasure and at the same time regulates the pleasure I'm having.
In a sense, there is some kind of control mechanism. It's similar, in my view, similar to that regulates body temperature. Basically, I think we have so much money in the bank in terms of pleasure in our lives. And we can expend that money over the course of a weekend in binging on cocaine, or we can expend it over a 2-week period in the normal pleasures of everyday life. But if you expend this pleasure neurochemicals in one go, such as a binge of drug addiction, then one pays for it. The system has to self-regulate. The system has to re-regulate and return to homeostasis.
What do you do for pleasure?
My favorite occupation when I'm not doing science is that I grow fruit trees, blackberries and peaches.
Koob's curiosity leads him to look at how artificial pleasure created by drugs differs from natural pleasures.
I mean, it's hard to make equivalent a 30-minute cocaine binge with my gardening, but if I were to do that, I would think that the pleasure that it's derived under each circumstance could be more or less the same. It's just condensed over time, and that, of course, explains why cocaine is such an unbelievably powerful reinforcing stimulus.
It gets there very quickly.
It gets there very quickly, and it activates those dopamine neurons much more quickly, presumably, than natural stimuli would do.
Koob believes the speed and intensity with which addictive drugs work in our brains uses up our dopamine supply. No more dopamine, no more pleasure.
So your brain's reward system is depleted. You get no pleasure from anything except drugs, and even the drugs don't do it anymore. So you have depleted the system. You're out of money in the bank.
It's not only that dopamine is depleted by chronic drug use, other neurotransmitters are affected as well.
When we measured the amount
Koob has recently discovered a neurotransmitter that jumpstarts the body's stress system after plentiful drug taking. To relieve the stress, the addict wants more.
And so alcoholics will report that they are drinking to reduce stress, when in fact the alcohol is producing more and more and more stress in them. And so then they start drinking to reduce the stress that the alcohol produced, and you get into this vicious cycle that we were talking about earlier.
2 feels good, so 3 is going to feel better, and then 4 will feel better. More is always better. That's the addict mind, is more is always better.
And so one of our passions right now, one of our major interests, for which we don't have a lot of the answers yet, but it's not only us, but many other laboratories across the country, are trying to understand how this cycle then translates into vulnerability to future relapses and future drug addiction. And that's pretty much where the action is. What we need to do is understand how this sequence of events leads to a vulnerability to relapse. And why do people go back? 80% of individuals who detoxify within a year go back to drug-seeking behavior and relapse.
Have you ever had a relapse?
Yes, yes I did. I relapsed after being in the program for 7 years.
I was cleaning my house, and I found this little yellow box that I used to stash my drugs. And before I knew it, I'd taken it. And it absolutely scared the hell out of me. I mean, I could not believe that from where I'd been that I would relapse.
Slick start talking. Slick is that little voice. That's what we give it a name, Slick. I'm powerless over Slick. You know what I mean?
Slick smarter than you?
Slick is very smart, Bill. I mean, whatever Slick tells you to do, you can't stop. You just do what it says. And Slick said, go ahead and get your drug of choice and get high.
If I'm feeling inadequate, if I'm feeling alone in the world, anything can trigger me. Anything can make me think that I need to use.
Relapse is really the cardinal and defining feature of addiction disorders. Patients always, with or without our help, will usually take a break from their drug use at some point, become drug-free. So they go through a period of detoxification, rehabilitation, feel that they're in pretty good shape. They may be in better physical condition they've been in a long time, highly motivated, but the difficulty is staying that way. What happens for patients with addictions is that the tendency to return is powerful.
What triggers that urge to use again when the addict already knows the hard way that using can be deadly?
I see.
This question drives the research of Dr. Anna Rose Childress.
COD this morning, I heard. Well, that might be the back.
Childress shows volunteer subjects videos she has made of drug-using situations.
Okay.
The mere sight of a hypodermic needle or a familiar street corner or another person using even on television can stimulate craving in the addict's brain.
Now that you've seen the videos,
as her research volunteers watch the videos, Childress makes images of their brains with the new PET scan technology.
patients describe that many of their episodes of relapse are preceded by craving state. So this work is directed towards seeing in the brain where this state occurs, and it gives you a way of rationally beginning to talk about what craving is. So what we want to do...
Yeah, we got to update it.
Anna Rose Childress is a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania's Treatment Research Center. She both studies addiction and teaches addicts how to deal with cravings.
But this is pretty realistic too. So where would you want to put the...
She began her work 15 years ago, using polygraph tests to indicate body changes when volunteers are exposed to cues that trigger craving.
All right, solid, man. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, the lighting on this is really good too. It's really so the best we can do is to bring in a videotape that's true to life, and the way that we get a good one is by using our patients as collaborators. They tell us when we've got the right thing. This is a pretty good close-up
Yeah,
scene.
I'm getting the sweats just watching it.
Before the session ends, Childress will work with her volunteers so they're not left in a state of craving drugs.
On the little bags.
All right, we're going in here, right, please?
On the streets of Philadelphia, Ron and Tony are helping Childress create authentic videotapes.
Okay, so let's start talking a little bit about what the bag is going to be like, the fact that you've heard it's really good stuff.
Both Ron and Tony have been battling heroin addiction for decades.
Octopus was out, and I did a shot it out, bag it out one day, man. I just crossed my knees, man. My eyeballs.
I like that. I mean, you know, I ain't had no dope where I crossed my knees in a long time, Cap.
Describe the pleasure you get out of that first high, that first rush.
Hey man, it's a utopia. It's like pardon me, Dr. Joe. I mean, like, it's like when you're reaching your climax, man.
An orgasm.
Yeah, it's like when you come to your climax, man. I've seen the time I say, wow.
That's perfect.
You know
In
what I
fact, he describes this spontaneously that way, but our patients often use sexual terms to describe this pleasure because it's certainly on that dimension, but what they will usually say is that it's very often like orgasm, but many times more strong.
Yeah,
but what happens the second and third time?
Well, that's when you see. This is one of the reasons you get hooked. Now we keep trying to find that first time. That first time is the greatest of all.
You always want to get back to the
that
first time, but you can't.
You can't. That's why we keep going. You keep going, trying to find that first time again, and you never find it.
I've been getting high for 30 years. I'm still trying to get it back again. I mean, the first time was just the ultimate, man.
What was it? What drug?
First time I ever shot was crystal meth.
Crystal
meth, speed.
Speed.
And it was like, I mean, it knocked me to my knees, and I came in my pants. That's how strong it was, the rush. And I'd go do about anything just to get a shot sometimes. I mean, it takes away all my problems of the day, or it takes away everything, man. It just numbs you.
And importantly, for all of these drugs, the vulnerability to return to use, the pull, the going back, that tendency is a cardinal feature of addictive disorders across the board, and it's there long after any withdrawal symptoms have ceased.
So the body
Long
remembers.
after the body remembers, and there's this desire to recapture that experience and to relive it again and again and again.
I've been in jail a few times, and I detox in jail. You know, you're sick for days and days. And like I said, I'll never do it. As soon as you get out, man, you're back doing the same shot again. I mean, I couldn't be out an hour, and I have it again. I've already kicked in. Time's been gone by. I did 6 months in jail.
And you don't want to go back to jail. You don't want to go back to jail.
The first day I got out, man, I did a shot. It's like,
why?
It pulls you back.
It just, I don't know what. I just love that high. I mean, it's just like, it's
like a
just
magnet.
immense.
It's a magnet. It's like a magnet.
What's a
Can't compare it.
Heroin, the feeling is a magnet. I did 3.5 one time. I swore.
3.5 in jail?
And swore I wasn't going. And man, I wasn't home an hour. I wasn't home an hour. You got the scratch?
Yeah, man. How about 6?
All right, my man.
Many addicts report the same experience of being pulled back to using. It's as if something turns on the autopilot to relapse.
Now, talk a little bit about the feeling that you sometimes get as you're about to get close to dope. It's almost like you've already used it.
I mean, just knowing that you're getting it is like, you can almost feel it, especially when you start cooking it up and smelling it, man. It's like,
You know what I mean? When you put that fire to that, boy, that smell that comes off of there, man, is...
That's a high just by itself.
You know what I mean? You know you get ready to
That's
get on.
an important thing, actually. He's describing that when he actually begins to cook up, that before the drug ever gets in the syringe, before it ever touches his arm, that he begins to feel a little bit of the high feeling before he even gets there. In animals, we've been able to see, when you put down little probes in the brain, that when you have things that remind the animals that a cocaine injection is coming or a heroin injection is coming, that it leads to an increase in the same chemical messenger in advance of the drug ever getting there that the real drug produces, like an increase in dopamine, the chemical messenger we've been talking about.
Go around the block, man. Meet me back up on the corner.
It's the simplest kind of association learning, and it's very powerful.
All right, man, listen, I'm gonna go back here and cop. I hope the dude's here now. You know what I mean?
So now seeing a certain street corner or seeing someone get high on a videotape or even in real life means opiates may be coming. It's not exactly a memory of, oh, I was on 38th Street and I remember. I know what this feeling was like. It takes me back to the feeling. So it's a feeling memory, and that's important.
An emotional memory.
Emotional memory, feeling memory.
Emotional memory has literally the emotional content or meaning attached. What emotion does is it evaluates something. It gives it its significance for us. When you use drugs, for example, not only do you remember the experience, the euphoria, the high, but also the scene, the precise scene, who you used it with, where you used it. Now, one of the things about emotional memory, which is so important, is that they are powerful and long-lived because they're associated with survival. You know, if sex weren't rewarding, nature's experiment with sexual reproduction would have been a failure.
If we didn't have sex, we wouldn't recreate ourselves. But when we have sex, we say, hey, that was good. Let's do it again.
You remember it. In the case of positive emotional memories, We think that the chemical dopamine is what's involved as marking them as survival enhancing. So when you encounter a wonderful new food, a wonderful new experience, dopamine is released. The next time, when you anticipate getting that new food, having that experience again, dopamine is now released in anticipation. Now, where the emotional memory is stored in response to these survival-enhancing positive memories is not yet entirely clear. Actually, the amygdala may play a role, so might the nucleus accumbens, which we've been talking about, but so might other parts of the brain. And one of the long-term hopes of this kind of approach in humans is that we'll be able to map exactly where these emotional memories are stored.
The amygdala, an almond-shaped structure in the brain, lights up on the screen when Childress takes PET scans of the brain during drug craving.
What we're able to see is that when our patients are viewing videos that remind them of their drug and entering this state of craving or desire, this structure seems to be differentially activated. When they're looking at nature videos from public television, the amygdala is not really all that interested. Another structure in the brain that seems to be differentially activated during this state is something called the anterior cingulate. So what we see here as sort of a developing signature of craving in the brain is that these structures are saying something emotional significant is about to happen. Okay, to what degree, 0 to 9, are you feeling any craving or desire for heroin at the moment?
8.
If we ignore these desire states that seem to persist long beyond the last use of the drug, long beyond the last sign of any withdrawal symptom, then we'll be missing the boat. And so part of our effort here has been to focus on developing strategies, whether they're behavioral strategies in terms of talking therapies to help people cope with these states when they're triggered, or whether it's medications that we would like to basically have that would be helpful in tuning down the compelling quality of this craving, not to the point that a person is without desire, because a person without desires
A zombie.
is numb, and no one would want to live that life, but to put them in a range that would be more manageable.
Dimers, double-stranded DNA.
Scientists working in the addiction field are studying all kinds of medications, vaccines, and therapies for their potential use in treatment. Their research often comes back to real-life experience.
I have been touched by many people who have been profoundly affected by addiction, both one branch of my family and one of my closest girlfriends who is my age just passed away several months ago from long-time abuse of alcohol and cocaine. So if I could do one thing in my life, it would be to discover some possible pharmacological treatment that would give people, individuals who find themselves profoundly addicted to these substances, just something that would even take the edge off for long enough to enable them to get on their feet, just enough to give them a chance through psychotherapy, through group work with other people like themselves, and fulfill their potential as humans.
Is the brain of the addict different?
I think it's clear that after they become a drug addict, their brain has changed, and it's probably changed forever. The real question is the brain of a potential addict different than the brain of a non-potential addict? And that's an issue that's still being explored. Large proportions of people who use drugs do not become addicted.
Most people who drink don't become alcoholics. Most people who take cocaine don't become addicts.
And actually, a large proportion of people who use heroin don't become heroin addicts.
Why can I have 2 glasses of wine and won't no more? And yet, my good friend can't stop with 6. Is that what you're asking?
Yes. I mean, we can only speculate at this point, but maybe someone has higher endogenous levels of stress hormones. Maybe someone has a deficit in dopamine function or a hyperdopamine function. We don't know at this point. That's going to be the real challenge for future work.
Trying to identify who's at risk?
Who is at risk and how to translate the information that we gain from the animal studies to the human studies.